There are moments in history when a single court ruling changes the temperature of an entire nation. Today might be one of those moments. An appeals court has just delivered a decision that will echo through Washington, through state capitals, and quite possibly all the way to the Supreme Court. The ruling? Donald Trump can keep National Guard forces deployed in the nation's capital. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another political headline, let me tell you why this matters more than you might realize. This isn't about left or right. This is about power, who wields it, who controls it, and what happens when the lines between federal authority and state sovereignty start to blur. In the world of investing, we always say, watch the structure, not just the story. And right now, the structure of American governance is being stress tested in real time. Stay with me. Because what's unfolding isn't chaos for chaos's sake. It's a chain reaction, and you need to understand what just got triggered. Let's start with the facts. According to court documents filed earlier today, a federal appeals court has granted a motion allowing the continuation of National Guard deployment in Washington, D.C., under federal command tied to executive authority. The decision reverses, or at least pauses, a lower court's injunction that had demanded the immediate withdrawal of these forces. Here's what the ruling allows. National Guard personnel, who had been mobilized under executive orders citing national security concerns and civil unrest prevention, can remain stationed in the District of Columbia. The appeals court found that the initial injunction was issued without sufficient consideration of the federal government's responsibility to protect federal property, maintain order in the nation's capital, and ensure continuity of government operations. Why is this controversial? Because the National Guard operates in a very delicate space. Normally, governors control their state's National Guard, but in Washington, D.C., a federal district, not a state, the lines are murkier. The president can activate guard units for federal missions, especially in D.C., where the federal government has unique jurisdiction. What changed compared to earlier rulings? The lower court had sided with civil rights groups and D.C. officials who argued that the deployment was unnecessary, constituted overreach, and violated the Posse Comitatus Act, a law that limits the use of military forces for domestic law enforcement. The appeals court, however, cited precedents involving emergency powers, protection of federal infrastructure, and the unique constitutional status of Washington, D.C. Legal analysts suggest the appeals court was persuaded by arguments that the executive has broad latitude in matters of national security, particularly within the Capitol, and that the lower court had acted too quickly without fully weighing the federal interest. In plain English, the court said the president has the authority to keep troops in D.C., at least for now. Now, let's talk about why this decision is so sensitive. The United States was built on a careful balance. The framers of the Constitution feared centralized military power. They remembered kings with standing armies. They remembered soldiers enforcing the will of distant rulers. So they divided power between federal and state, between branches of government, between civilian and military authority. The National Guard embodies that balance. These are citizen soldiers trained to serve their communities in emergencies, floods, hurricanes, civil unrest. Governors call them up. Governors send them home. That's the norm. But in Washington, D.C., things are different. D.C. isn't a state. It doesn't have a governor in the traditional sense. It has a mayor, but the federal government retains significant control. The president, not the mayor, commands the D.C. National Guard. This setup exists because Washington is the seat of federal power, the Capitol, the White House, the Supreme Court. The framers wanted to ensure that the federal government could protect itself. However, that same structure creates tension. If federal forces can be deployed at presidential discretion without local consent or clear judicial oversight, where does that power end? Courts rarely allow such deployments without debate because history teaches us that military force in domestic spaces is dangerous. It's not that soldiers are bad. It's that the presence of military power changes the psychology of a place. It signals crisis. It raises stakes. It can intimidate as much as it protects. That's why this ruling is so closely watched. It's not just about troops on street corners. It's about the precedent. It's about what future presidents might claim they can do, citing today's decision as justification. So what happened in that courtroom? According to legal filings and statements from attorneys involved, the appeals panel consisted of 3 judges. Reports suggest the vote was not unanimous, meaning at least one judge dissented, though dissenting opinions have not yet been fully published. The majority opinion, as summarized by legal observers, hinged on three main arguments. First, the unique status of Washington, D.C. The court noted that D.C. is not simply another city. It is the capital of the United States, and the Constitution grants Congress plenary authority over it. By extension, the executive has responsibilities here that differ from those in the 50 states. The judges referenced historical precedents, including deployments during the Civil War, after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and following the events of January 6, 2021. Second, the question of immediate harm. The lower court had issued an injunction based on claims that the National Guard presence was unlawful and harmful, but the appeals court found that the plaintiffs did not sufficiently demonstrate imminent and irreparable harm that would justify such an extraordinary remedy. The majority suggested that policy disagreements, however passionate, do not automatically meet the legal standard for an emergency injunction. Third, deference to executive judgment in national security matters. Courts have long recognized that the executive branch has significant discretion in matters of national defense and emergency response. The appeals judges appeared to weigh heavily the government's assertion that intelligence assessments and ongoing security reviews justified the continued presence of Guard forces. Now, what are legal experts saying? Opinions are sharply divided. Constitutional scholars on one side warn that the decision grants too much deference to executive power without sufficient checks. They cite the Youngstown Sheet and Tube case, a landmark ruling that limited presidential authority, and argue that courts must not rubber stamp military deployments in civilian contexts. On the other side, national security law experts argue that the ruling is consistent with decades of precedent recognizing the president's role as commander-in-chief and the federal government's unique responsibilities in the Capitol. One former federal prosecutor, speaking on background, reportedly said the appeals court is essentially saying we're not going to second-guess the executive on security decisions in real time. If there's overreach, Congress or the Supreme Court can address it. And that brings us to the next question. What could reverse this decision? The plaintiffs, civil liberty groups, and D.C. officials have already announced they will petition for an en banc review, meaning the full appeals court, not just a three-judge panel, would reconsider the case. If that fails, they will almost certainly ask the Supreme Court to intervene. Legal observers suggest a Supreme Court review is likely given the constitutional significance, but the court could also decline, letting the appeals decision stand. Timeline? If history is any guide, the Supreme Court could act quickly if it perceives an emergency, or it could let the matter simmer while lower courts continue to litigate. In the meantime, the National Guard stays. Now, let's shift perspective for a moment. You might be wondering, what does this have to do with markets, with economics, with the kind of thinking that guides long-term decisions? Everything. Markets don't like uncertainty. Investors don't like ambiguity. Businesses don't like environments where the rules keep changing. When you see military forces deployed in your capital city, not because of a natural disaster, not because of a foreign invasion, but because of internal tensions, it sends a signal. That signal is instability. Now, I'm not saying the sky is falling. I'm not predicting a market crash. But here's what I've learned over decades. Institutions matter. Stability matters. The rule of law matters. When those things are called into question, even subtly, capital gets cautious. Think of it this way. If you're a foreign investor looking at the United States, you're watching this. You're asking, is this a country where courts settle disputes, or a country where military presence becomes normalized? You're asking, can I trust the contracts I sign, the regulations I navigate, the legal system that protects my assets? These are not abstract questions. They affect currency flows, bond yields, corporate investment decisions, domestic. Cali businesses are watching too. If you're a CEO, you're thinking about supply chains, employee safety, political risk. You might not say it publicly, but privately you're adjusting your models. This is what Warren Buffett calls uncertainty premium. When the future is hard to predict, people demand higher returns to compensate for risk. They pull back, they wait, they hedge. And here's the thing, uncertainty compounds. It's like leverage in reverse. A little doubt becomes a lot of caution. A lot of caution becomes paralysis. Now, to be clear, the American economy is resilient. Markets have weathered worse. But resilience doesn't mean immunity. It means adaptation. And adaptation takes time, energy, and cost. So when I see a court ruling that keeps military forces in the Capitol, I don't just see a legal decision. I see a stress test. I see the system being pushed. And I ask, how much stress can the system absorb before something gives? That's not fear-mongering. That's risk assessment. It's the same calculation you'd make before buying a stock, before investing in a company, before betting your retirement on any particular outcome. You look at the fundamentals. You look at the structure. You ask whether the foundation is solid or whether cracks are forming. Predictably, the public reaction has been intense. On social media, the hashtags are trending. Cable news is wall-to-wall coverage. Opinion pieces are flying. Everyone has a take. Those who support the decision argue that the president has a duty to maintain order, protect federal property, and ensure that Washington, D.C. remains secure. They point to threats, both real and perceived, and argue that the National Guard is a stabilizing presence, not an occupying force. They say the courts did the right thing by deferring to executive expertise. Those who oppose the decision see it very differently. They argue, this is a dangerous precedent, a step toward authoritarianism, a militarization of civilian space. They worry about the chilling effect on protests, on dissent, on the very freedoms the Constitution is supposed to protect. They ask, if this is acceptable now, what comes next? And here's where media framing becomes critical. Some outlets are calling this a victory for law and order. Others are calling it a green light for executive overreach. Same event, completely different narratives. Why does framing matter? Because it shapes perception, and perception drives action. If you believe the National Guard is necessary, you support the deployment. If you believe it's unnecessary, you see occupation. And in a country already divided, these perceptions harden into positions, and positions harden into conflict. What I find most concerning, and I say this as someone who's watched many cycles of boom and bust, crisis and recovery, is the loss of common ground. There was a time when people could disagree about policy but agree on process. Today, even the process is contested. When courts rule, one side celebrates, the other mobilizes. When executives act, one side applauds, the other resists. There's less trust, less patience, less willingness to accept outcomes we don't like. And that's dangerous. Not because dissent is bad, dissent is healthy, but because without some baseline of shared rules, of mutual respect, of institutional legitimacy, you get chaos. You get a society that can't solve problems because it can't even agree on how to have the conversation. So where do we go from here? In the short term, the National Guard remains in Washington, D.C. The appeals court decision stands, at least for now. But this is far from over. The plaintiffs will almost certainly escalate. They'll request an en banc hearing. If that fails, they'll petition the Supreme Court. Given the company institutional stakes, it's hard to imagine the court completely ignoring this case, though it may choose to act slowly, letting the issue develop further in lower courts. Meanwhile, Congress could get involved. There are already reports that some lawmakers are drafting legislation to clarify the limits of National Guard deployment in D.C. Others are calling for hearings. Still others are calling for impeachment proceedings, though that seems more symbolic than practical. Public pressure will continue. Protests, counter-protests, rallies, press conferences. The attention won't fade quickly. And then there's the question of what happens on the ground. Does the presence of the National Guard actually prevent incidents, or does it provoke them? Does it reassure citizens, or does it alienate them? These are empirical questions, and the answers will shape the debate. If nothing dramatic happens, if the weeks pass quietly, the urgency will decrease, and the political cost of reversing the decision will rise. If, on the other hand, there's a confrontation, an incident, a flashpoint, then everything changes. The narrative shifts, the pressure intensifies, and the courts might reconsider. In other words, this is a dynamic situation. We're not at the end, we're in the middle. The next chapter is being written right now by judges, by politicians, by protesters, by you. Let me leave you with a thought. Power is a strange thing. It's necessary, but it's dangerous. Every society needs someone to make decisions, to enforce rules, to protect the vulnerable. But every society also needs limits, checks on that power, accountability, transparency. The genius of the American system, when it works, is that it balances these needs. Courts check executives, legislatures check courts, states check the federal government, citizens check all of them through elections, protests, and speech. But ants is fragile. It requires restraint. It requires institutions that people trust. It requires leaders who respect the rules even when the rules constrain them. What we're seeing right now is a test of that balance. An appeals court has ruled that the president can keep National Guard forces in Washington. That ruling may be legally sound, it may be practically necessary, but it's also a reminder that power once claimed is hard to relinquish. History is full of examples, some tragic, some cautionary, of leaders who believed they needed extraordinary authority to meet extraordinary threats. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they weren't. The difference often came down to one thing: restraint. Did the leader use only the power necessary? Did they give it up when the crisis passed? Did they respect the institutions meant to constrain them? We don't know yet how this chapter will end. We don't know if the National Guard will be in D.C. for weeks, months, or longer. We don't know if the Supreme Court will step in. We don't know if Congress will act. What we do know is this: the choices made now will echo. They'll set precedents, they'll shape norms, they'll influence how future leaders think about power, how courts think about deference, how citizens think about their government. So watch carefully, ask questions, demand accountability. Don't let the noise distract you from the structure, because in the end, this isn't just about Donald Trump. It's not just about the National Guard. It's not just about one court ruling. It's about whether the system holds, whether the balance endures, whether power stays tethered to law. And that, my friends, is a story worth following. Thank you for watching. Stay informed.